for everybody that's watching out there, just keep in the back of your mind, what can we learn from the Yellowstone, and kind of ask yourself that question as we're going through these clips. We've got a couple clips for you guys. And also as we're just kind of talking about these clips and dissecting them, because I think there's a lot of great messages in there. Randy and his team did a great job really showcasing what the Yellowstone is, its beauty, its ecosystem in its entirety. And so I'm excited for this, and I think it's going to be a great conversation.
Well, what we'll do is, with us, you and I are the talking heads, but we have three really important people in the background who are making this operation work. Here in my office, I've got Jonathan Spear. In Portland, you have Matthew Newberg and Betsy Emery. Yep. And they're in charge of all this, curating the questions that will come in. And at the end, once we get through these segments, we're going to do a little Q&A session. Is that what I understand?
I think you're right.
Okay. So I'm going to give just a quick point. So when people see this first clip, this story about the Allenspur Dam, it was called, would have dammed the Yellowstone River just south of Livingston, Montana, and flooded it way back into the back ends of the Paradise Valley, would have disrupted the flow of the river, and would have allowed for dewatering of the Yellowstone River in its low flows for the purpose of diverting water for 40 coal-fired generating plants between Livingston and Billings, Montana. So the characters involved, Jim Posowitz is my conservation mentor. I've known Jim for 25 years, sat on his board of directors for 15 years, and we just he's a legend in Montana. And then Mike Duncan, who you'll see in this first part, Mike is a PhD in fisheries, and he did all of his PhD work on the Yellowstone. So I happen to know Mike before this idea ever came up, and I knew he was a PhD candidate then and finished everything, and I knew he'd researched the Yellowstone. So when we started to tell this story, I was like, wow, what a cool generational bridge from Jim, who's 85, to Mike, who's in his 30s, and me just get out of the way because I don't have much to add. But so this first clip is going to show the Yellowstone and all of its beauty. So we want to go to that clip now?
I think so. Let her rip.
All right, I'm going to point. When I point like this, that means I'm pointing to Jonathan Spear, who's in charge of loading these clips. So here we go.
The Yellowstone it's magical. It's the last great example we have of how a Great Plains, Northern Rockies river system should function. It's really hard to find this anywhere else. The one thing that sets the Yellowstone apart from most other rivers in this part of the world is that it's able to maintain its natural flow regime, meaning that there are no dams that alter the discharge on the Yellowstone from top to bottom. So in the 70s, there was a proposal for a dam to go in on the Yellowstone just upstream of Livingston called the Allenspur Dam. And had that dam gone in, that certainly would have changed how the river functions down here. Because it didn't go in, we still have a relatively intact native fish assemblage. So we're in the upper Yellowstone, inside Yellowstone National Park. This is a stronghold for Yellowstone cutthroat.
fish. Oh man, I'm done. I'm retired. I'm not topping that one.
All right, Chris, I think that clip is over. The technology guy just pointed at me, which says, hey, you guys are live again now. So hopefully with that clip, people got to see how beautiful the Yellowstone is today.
I mean, Mike Duncan says it right in the sense that this river was able to maintain its natural flow regime, which is so pivotal for its ecosystem. When someone talks about an ecosystem of this river, we're not talking about just a small area, maybe through town, which there are sub ecosystems there, but we're talking about from its headwaters all the way where it flows to the Missouri. And it's in a great example of what that looks like in a natural way. And so I think it's a fantastic short little clip.
Yeah, for us here who are so blessed to live in Montana, we see the Yellowstone and the headwaters of the Yellowstone and the Missouri, which are two parallel rivers almost in Montana. One is dammed extensively, the Missouri is, and the Yellowstone flows into that eventually just right across the North Dakota border, and their headwaters are very close to each other. The path they take through foothills, through mountain valleys, and then out into prairie areas make them almost identical. But when you look at the two rivers, they are completely different in terms of their native habitats, their fish communities, their just the riparian areas. Everything about them are completely different. So we have the benefit of that contrast right here in our backyard. And it's quite stark, and it causes us to look at the Yellowstone as quite a complete gem. And it's a treasure for us and for the whole country.
And then, unfortunately, if you look at the contrast over here, specifically the Snake River is the largest tributary of the Columbia. So very similar in the sense that the Yellowstone is a large tributary of the Missouri. The Snake River is a large tributary of the Columbia. And when we're talking about dams, we're talking about specifically the lower four Snake River dams on the lower section of the river. These dams have now blocked off 140 miles of actual navigable river. They've blocked off about 14,000 acres of riparian habitat. So when you were talking about how on the Yellowstone everything's intact, now on the Snake we have a completely segmented and fractioned river that has completely changed the habitat that specifically salmon and steelhead need to reproduce, survive, and continue their life history. And so I think Mike Duncan, I don't know if we're going to be showing it in these segments, but Mike Duncan mentions there's a specific sturgeon, right? There's an iconic sturgeon on the Yellowstone that actually, it uses the entire Yellowstone River, goes into the lower section to, I don't think breeding, but for off breeding seasons, and then goes into the upper section to breed. Just like salmon and steelhead, they're using this entire river system where they're breeding at the headwaters and the gravelly areas of the Snake River, and then swimming all the way down, all the way through the Columbia out to the Pacific Ocean. That's hundreds and hundreds of miles.
Yeah. And
they're meeting these dams along the way. And so when you're looking at saving an iconic species like that specific sturgeon on the Yellowstone, well, we're looking at iconic species, salmon and steelhead, here on the Snake that are going extinct right in front of our faces. And so it's one of those things that, why don't we do anything about it? And I think this is one of the biggest things that we can learn from the Yellowstone, is that we can save these species if dams are removed, if rivers maintain their natural flow regime, if we can maintain habitat, if we can maintain cold water and clean water.
We're lucky we get to see the Yellowstone undammed, longest undammed river in the lower 48. And so if you talk to certain scientists and biologists, they'll say rivers are like a living organism. You can't cut a section out of it and expect the head and the lower part to survive, just like anything else, or at least what remains of it is not going to be its natural state. And so we are the beneficiaries of all this great work that people are going to see in the next clip, kind of this David and Goliath story of Jim Posowitz doing some amazing work, him and a group of grassroots people, his scientists and biologists within the Montana Department. Now it's called Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. At the time it was Fish and Game. And there was a significant professional risk in doing what he did. In this clip, people will see that a lot of the history, or a lot of the things we hear today about, energy independence, jobs, progress, all these things were the same, at least they were the issues that were brought up in 1978, 79. And this next clip really gets to the core of the story of how did one small group of scientists who stuck to their guns and were advocates for this wild river and the wild things and the people and communities that depended on it, they somehow pulled it off. So
I'm excited for this next clip. It's the meat and potatoes of it, and where I get really passionate about conservation, especially fisheries conservation and watershed conservation. So I hope people do too.
Cool. Jonathan Spear, are we ready? All right, here we go. So Jim and Gail, this is Mike. Michael.
Nice to meet you, Mike Duncan.
Michael Duncan, okay.
One of the things I've most looked forward to is getting the chance to meet Jim. He's done just phenomenal work throughout his career over the last 50 years throughout Montana to help conserve many of the fisheries throughout the state, whether it's the Yellowstone, the Blackfoot. He's been all over and done a lot of great work throughout the years and is well known throughout the fisheries community. So it's, I've heard about him and read stories about him and know about his work on the Yellowstone, but I've never had the opportunity to meet him. Without his hard work and others like him, we wouldn't have the Yellowstone we do today.
That cushion seat in the front,
oh my God, I never had anything so good.
The captain's chair right here.
As much as I've known Jim for more than 25 years, it was probably 5 years into our relationship before I learned about the Allenspur Dam. And people around here, locals here, started telling me, oh, I see that you hang out with Jim. Do you know the story of the Allenspur Dam? And I didn't. Finally, one day I said, Jim, I need to know the story of this Allenspur Dam. He said, well, how much time you have? And I said, Jim, I have a lot of time for that story.
Good evening. 3 weeks ago, I spoke to you about the national energy crisis and our policy for meeting it.
If you were around in the 1970s, you remember the long lines at gas stations as a result of the OPEC nations and their oil embargo. It created an energy crisis in the United States.
Richard Nixon was our president. He called for Project Energy Independence.
I have appointed an Energy Emergency Action Group.
And the Allenspur Dam was one of those projects put forward.
Congress, the federal agencies, the energy corporations, the President of the United States, all piling on to cool their power plants. And what they needed was a third of this river, essentially to dry her up. We sent 3 guys here to fight that. In time, that would grow to 26 people spread the full length of the river, looking at everything we could think of to look at.
And in doing that, they were accumulating the information to do what was right for wildlife and the river. Jim's team put that puzzle together and made the case that this river needed every piece of it to be intact. And those findings put them in a situation where they had no choice but to stand up and take the arrows on behalf of the Yellowstone River.
You don't go into a battle without having the truth on your side. And we could stand before power if we had the truth.
Most everyone here in the community, whether it's the anglers, the farmers, the ranchers, have an appreciation for what the Yellowstone offers. Had Allenspur gone in and we'd be sitting under a reservoir now, that definitely would have changed the dynamic in Paradise Valley and the surrounding communities. It would have displaced farmers here in the valley, a lot of ranches here in the valley that have been here for well over 100 years.
When I asked Jim, how did you pull this off? This is David and Goliath in the classic sense. And he gets a smile and he says, well, you just got to pull out every card you have. You got to talk to every person you know, reach out to anyone who might be helpful.
You go to your court of last resort, and that's the public. That's where the power in a democracy resides. We realize we have got to launch a major public education process. A guy named Tom Perro, who was CEO of Trout Unlimited at the time, somehow he learned that Glenmore Distiller was going to come out with a new brand of whiskey called Yellowstone Mellow Mash. They were going to hold a tennis or golf tournament to introduce their new product. And Perro thought, why don't they take that 40 to 50 grand and invest it in a campaign to save the Yellowstone? And I'm thinking, that's a really good idea. We'd never done anything like that before. Well, there's quite a potential here to make this a national issue. Press tour gets set up, held after fall equinox, because I wanted snow on the Absarokas and I wanted the cottonwoods golden. We had reporters coming from Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Penthouse even showed up. Put them in small planes, and this is all being paid for now by Rand Public Relations with Glenmore Distillers' money. Flew them over Yellowtail Dam, flew them over the coal fields, and then landed them in Livingston, drove them up to Chico, threw them all into plunge, and then the next day gave them a briefing from our scientific studies of the river. And they all got at least 10 miles of Yellowstone River floating fish. Within days, the stories started coming out.
They used their platforms to take the case to the American citizen and lay it out as, here is what we are putting up as the sacrifice for energy independence. And when America got to see that story, they said, no way, this is not going to happen. And because they prevailed, I can stand here right now and look at the Yellowstone River as still the longest undammed river in the lower 48.
Well, I think, Chris, that we're back live. Jonathan tells me he gave me this, which means it's back to you. So interesting to see that piece about just this iconic river being the battlegrounds for the classic, conservation versus jobs and all the other things. And to see Jim talk about it and to float the river with him that day and hear him tell the story, he really had some profound pieces there that, even though I've known him for a long time, I still write these little, I call them pausisms. We call them pause. I write those down because those are gems that whenever I'm involved in any conservation issue, he usually has something that's really relevant to whatever the topic is. So
yeah, no, he has some specific quotes in there where I believe, I'm going to paraphrase, but when you have the truth on your side, we can stand in front of power. And I think that resonates the most with me when I watched this section of the film, because, back in the day, it was the same arguments, right? It's going to be energy, irrigation, economy. And we're seeing those same arguments today, but on the opposite side, right?
Yeah.
Whereas it might have been warranted, and really the lower 4 dams on the Snake were put in because of energy, and because of barging or shipping. But right now they're at a point where they either need to get rebuilt or basically fixed up, or they need to be taken out and removed. You know, there's just so many myths now around them, because the argument that, well, we can't take these dams out because they produce critical electricity. Well, they only create about 4% of Bonneville's power. It's low grade hydroelectric power. And right now, with the advances in renewable energy, specifically around wind and solar, that can be completely replaced and be extremely more efficient. The argument that if we remove these dams, we're going to basically need them for irrigation. There's only one reservoir that has a few irrigators on that reservoir that can be completely replaced by other technology that's out there that I know for a fact that Yellowstone uses for farmers along the Yellowstone. The argument that it's going to tank the economy, it's really not. If we look at fishing and recreational angling here alone in Oregon, Oregon produces $1.4 billion in jobs and retail sales for recreational angling a year.
Wow.
And so if we can increase that here on the Snake, that's going to be huge and go leaps and bounds, right? And then lastly, if we look at barging, you know, we can't remove these dams because they're critical barging. In the last 20 years, barging and shipping has decreased in that area by 70%. Alternatives exist. We can use freight. We can use trains. We can definitely, today it's a time now where we can definitely breach these dams.
Yeah. Well, what we have the benefit of with the Yellowstone story is we have 40 years of reflection.
Yeah.
And this whole thing happened in 78, 79, and 80. And it had built up for the 8 or 10 years before that, but it finally came to a head in the late 70s. And at the time, anybody who was opposed to the dam was considered an obstructionist and this and that. And now, if you came to Livingston, Montana, Big Timber, Montana, Emigrant Prairie, any of these places along the river and said, oh, we're going to put a dam here and we're going to this and we're going to that, you'd want a pretty good security detail if you started talking about those kind of, it'd be blasphemy here in Montana. And so we have that benefit of reflection that you don't always get. And you know, Jim, you said quoted his one comment about we can stand before power because we had the truth. And he went on to say that the power in a democracy resides in the people. And the court of last resort is the public. And those are all very true things. And whatever the conservation issue is that we're discussing, it seems like our society wants to make it an either or and not consider alternatives or better practices or new ideas. And hopefully the Yellowstone story shows what it can be like. Yeah, we didn't go through the issue of placing a dam and having to remove it, but it certainly is an example of the values that a wild river has for so many things and so many reasons.
And now we have, unfortunately, here on the Snake and the Columbia, an example of, because these dams were put in back in the 60s and 70s, exactly the exact same time that the Allenspur Dam was being proposed. You know, we have 50, 60 years of reflection on what these dams have done to a natural and wild river, right? If we look at salmon and steelhead alone, the Snake River used to account for about 50% of salmon and steelhead for the Columbia River Basin. Annually, that was approximately around 8 million fish a year.
Wow.
That's a lot of fish.
Yeah.
We're lucky to get back, if we just look at Chinook, we're lucky to get back 100,000 fish. We're even more lucky to get any fish above the 4 dams on the Snake. In 2017, there was only 250 pairs of Chinook salmon that made it past all 4 dams to spawning grounds.
Wow.
Like that should be a statistic alone showing the fact that these dams have a significant effect on how these on these fish's life histories, to the point that we're losing them and we're continuing to lose them. Unfortunately, every single year or every handful of years, the federal government puts out an environmental impact statement that tells us, okay, things that we already know, fish are in decline, specifically salmon and steelhead. And they propose basically a recovery effort. There's been 5 major recovery efforts for salmon and steelhead on the lower Snake that have failed every single time. In the last 20 years, there's been over $17 billion spent on these recovery efforts, 17 billion with a B, of taxpayer dollars that have showed basically zero results. And so it's one of those slaps in the face where, okay, we've tried basically almost everything that we have in our tool belt. The next biggest thing, which is stated in the most current environmental impact statement by the Army Corps of Engineers, that breaching the dams would have the most significant impact to recovering historical runs of salmon and steelhead.
Wow. Wow. Those are crazy numbers. So I think we get to this last segment here, and then we do some question and answer. If you're ready for that, or if
yeah, I'm ready for that. I'm definitely ready for that.
So this segment's pretty short. It kind of wraps it up and puts it in the context of, hopefully gives people a reason to smile about the success of the Yellowstone, and gives them some feeling about, hey, what can I do? Hope is not forlorn. There is opportunity, and we'll talk about that when we get through this segment. So, Jonathan Spear, are we ready?
Jim provides me with inspiration to figure out how I'm going to be able to contribute going forward. I feel like my work will help guide future management decisions, conservation of certain species on the river. And I think this river really highlights one thing for me, and we try to instill it in our boys, that find something that you're passionate about and pursue it and protect it. Can't imagine now that we're out here raising them anywhere else. There's not too many opportunities to help prevent a dam from going in, but there's certainly smaller ways that folks can contribute. There's always work to be done, and everyone can contribute somehow, some way, and conserve what we've got.
All right, I got this signal, Chris. That means the segment is over and you are live. So Mike does a good job of wrapping it up and thinking about what this wild river means to him, what it's meant to him as a fisheries biologist, a PhD candidate, and all the research he did. And I can share his sentiment as someone who only lives 25 miles from that river. And it provides so much to so many of us. And the lesson that it provides us is that a lot can be done. And I use the Yellowstone as a perfect example about how conservation happens in the United States, happens by the people and for the people. And it has 3 basic principles in my mind. It's always difficult. I mean, conservation is not easy. Look, you talk about five EISs on the snake, and it still hasn't brought results. That's just hard work. It's always uncomfortable. No matter what you submit, no matter what idea you have, someone will be upset. It might be a family member, it might be a coworker, it might be a neighbor, who knows, but it comes with its series of discomforts, and it's always inconvenient. And I use this Allenspur Dam when a lot of people say, well, I just don't have time. And I get that we're all busy, but I often think about, what if Jim and all those scientists that he brought together, and all the grassroots people up and down the river who advocated on behalf of a wild river, what if they all would have said, oh, I'm too busy, I'll do that next week, or how about next summer? Well, those three principles of difficulty, discomfort, and inconvenience are just part of what we have to accept when we're working on conservation, especially the hard conservation. And the Yellowstone shows the benefit and the results of just seeing it through.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And before I get into it, but I think we definitely need a Be Like Jim shirt. I think I don't know if you can produce those. I don't know if there's any trademarks out there, but a Be Like Jim shirt would be pretty badass.
Yeah, he's a remarkable guy, and he probably lived those three principles of conservation as well as anybody I know. And he gives us this example of what you can do when you don't let yourself be discouraged or let your effort be thwarted just because it's difficult or because it's uncomfortable. And he and his core of scientists within the agency paid a professional price after this whole effort, and they prevailed. Their division within the agency was dismantled via budget process. And so they all paid a professional price to keep the Yellowstone a wild river. And it's unfortunate, but I'm thankful that we have people in our agencies who are willing to represent the wild things, the wild places, and those of us who love them.
Yeah, and it's exactly like he said, back in the second segment where it was, the power is or the democracy and power is in the people. We need people right now. We need those voices. We need that grassroots upbringing for the Snake River, right? For these dams to speak on behalf of salmon and steelhead. And so, just like Randy, just like what you're saying, it's uncomfortable, but we need the voices right now. We need people to turn out. And so, for anybody that's watching and feels compelled, there's a description in the into the YouTube section, I believe, right? I think I'm saying that.
I believe you're right.
But you can click on that link. It'll send it to Northwest Steelheaders page, and you'll actually be able to fill out some information. It'll take you less than 30 seconds, but you'll get call to action alerts. You'll get more information about the Snake River. Obviously, we have a short time for me and you to talk about it today, but there's a whole host of other facts, issues, and anything else that really speaks to this campaign to remove these dams and protect salmon and steelhead specifically. And so you can definitely, for anybody that's watching right now, go there, learn more, sign up, and be part of the voice and speak out for those that can't.
Well, and I appreciate any group that is advocating for wild things and wild places. Just listening to you talk, and as we've prepared for this event tonight, it just caused me to think about what I take for granted in having this amazing river from its headwaters in Yellowstone Park all the way to the confluence with the Missouri. It causes me to feel a little more gratitude and not take it for granted. Understand how valuable that free, wild flowing river is to all the communities along that river, the jobs that have been built around having that river intact, and just yeah, it's just a treasure for all of us who live here, but also for those who travel and come here. If anybody comes to Yellowstone Park and drives from Yellowstone to the north entrance in Gardner, try to imagine yourself under 200 feet of water, and that's just, my mind can't go there. And
I can't either.
I'm just thankful for those people who stood to be counted when the time came. And whether it's a piece of landscape you love, a wild and scenic river, whatever it is, there's probably a Jim Posowitz type story behind that. And maybe someday there'll be that kind of story written about how the recovery of salmon and steelhead came about on the Lower Snake.
Let's make it happen.
Well, I appreciate your advocacy.
Well, no, thank you so much, Randy, for letting us use your platform and speak to hopefully as many people as we can about this issue and really move it forward. So yeah, no, I can't thank you enough for your voice in conservation and doing this.
Sure. I see we got a question here from Adam. It says, would removal of the dams impact water aquifer levels? I understand some are dropping by as much as 9 feet per year in the area. Would removing the dams and reducing the infiltration potential? Not sure.
That's a tough one. I'm not an aquifer expert, and so I can guess, but I would take it as a guess for people. And most of the river is on bedrock, and so I'm imagining that not a lot of it is going into aquifers, but I could be completely wrong. So don't take me. That's definitely outside of my wheelhouse.
Like I said, you get to answer all the questions. Read them. So I'm kind of the storyteller in this, and you get all the focus put on you as the expert. But Annie has a question.
Yeah.
And this is one I have zero. This is I couldn't even flip a coin probably to answer this one. But how do the seals and sea lions congregating at the mouth of the river, I assume the Columbia, affect the salmon steelhead returns as the fish try to go up the salmon ladders?
So yeah, that's one of the things that when we put barriers like that in place, it's an unnatural barrier that these salmon and steelhead are actually congregating and waiting to get past if there is a fish ladder. If there isn't a fish ladder, then they're SOL, right? To put it bluntly. And so what has happened is that sea lions specifically over the last handful of years have learned specific traits through following leaders up the river, and have learned that they can basically sit at these dams and just basically have a buffet 24 hours a day, especially during like heightened runs. A specific result here on the Willamette River, which is another tributary of the Columbia, over, I think in 2019 or 2018, a little over 800 steelhead made it over the Willamette Falls, which is a significant barrier. Sea lions were there. They sit there basically anywhere from 10 to 11 months out of the year, just basically munching on these fish. And so in 2018, a little over 800 fish made it over the dams. Oregon went through a long legislation period to get basically federal permission to remove these sea lions through lethal measures. In 2019, they removed, I believe, over 30 sea lions, approximately 30 sea lions. And immediately that spring, approximately over 3,000 steelhead made it over the dams. And so it's quick gratification like that makes these decisions easy. But we wouldn't have these conflicts and predation if we didn't have these dams. One thing I didn't touch about within the earlier section was that when you fragment these parts of these rivers, we create these reservoirs we're changing the habitat so much that we're actually decreasing the water temperature as well as the water flow. Salmon and steelhead need cold, fast running water to be able to get up to spawning grounds and to survive. And so when you build a reservoir, you're increasing the temperature. Anything above 70 degrees is lethal to salmon and steelhead. You're also increasing the temperature so that different species of fish are allowed to actually congregate in these reservoirs now. Specifically, you have more invasive predators, fish species of preying on salmon smolts. And so that's even decreasing population returns even more when you're creating these reservoirs. And so there's just an onslaught of really bad cards dealt to salmon and steelhead with these rivers or with these dams when they're put in. You know, there are wild fish, they're wild fish originally, and they're stacked against a lot of odds, basically coming from headwaters, going from, hundreds of miles from the headwaters all the way to the Columbia, having to survive in the Pacific Ocean, where they're making a journey all the way up to Alaska and then coming back down, sometimes multiple times, but within a 2 to 5 year span, they're in the Pacific Ocean, facing all those predators in different ocean conditions. And then they still have to come back and come up the Columbia, back up to the Snake, back up to the headwaters. And now you put increased predation, increased water temperature, decreased flow, and major barriers on these rivers. It's like, why, let's they're already extinct. It's that bad. And we're just talking about the 4 lower Snake River dams right now. Yeah. Within the Columbia River Basin, which stretches across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and even Montana, we're looking at over 400 dams on the entire Columbia River Basin.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna answer the next question.
Oh yeah, go for it.
It has to do with the Yellowstone. Mark asks, is the Yellowstone managed by limiting use by utilizing permits for fishing and rafting? No. It's anybody can go anytime they want. Yeah, you got to buy a fishing license if you want to fish. But it's if you wanted to, you could get in I'd suggest getting in below Yankee Jim Canyon instead of coming over the fall of that Yankee Jim. But you could raft all the way to North Dakota. Don't need a permit. Don't need anything on the upper stretches. You're going to catch those big, fat, like you saw Mike catching those Yellowstone cutthroats. And as you transition down the river, when you get to the far end where it's almost so muddy you can plow it, there you're going to catch native species like sauger, and catfish, and stuff that's been there. So for that whole transition of that river, we have all that, and we don't have to use any permit system or anything like that to manage the recreational use of it. So.
Well, just like how you haven't caught a steelhead out here, I've never flowed the Yellowstone, so we might have to figure something out where we can trade a trip or two.
Well, this one is kind of personal. I don't know if you want to answer it, Chris. Conrad asks, what are some of the conservation issues that are important to your personal impact legacies? What are you doing to move toward your legacy, and what is holding you back? Quotation, or in parens, personal questions for Chris and Randy.
Do you want to tackle that first, Randy?
Yeah, I'll tackle it. For I don't know if I'm ever going to have a quote unquote legacy, but for me is to show people that there is a path forward in conservation. I speak, and all of our platforms are built about public lands, conservation. Most of it's hunting, but we do a lot of fishing, and it's all about clean air, clean water, wild places, wild things. And I use these platforms to try do that. I can't say that I always am successful, but we try hard. Every whiteboard right here to my left says to promote self-guided public land hunting and create advocates for that cause. And that cause is conservation, whether it's the conservation of the land, conservation of the species. That's what I try to spend my time doing. I'm blessed to live in the greatest country in the world, where we as the public get to go and do these things that a lot of places you don't get to go do that. So that's hopefully what I'm doing explains what the vision for me is, and what holds me back. My below average talent is usually what holds me back, and the fact that there are only 24 hours in a day. The two things that hold me back. But
I guess I'll take a stab at it, and I echo a lot of what Randy just said. For me too, it's heavily on conservation, but being able to preserve a lot of these opportunities that I have right now, being able to go outside, hunt, fish, hike, bike, on all these great different places, on all these different river systems here in the lower 48 and in Alaska and Hawaii. But I also want to be able to preserve those for the next generation, for my kids, if I have kids one day, and their kids, and to hopefully create opportunities so that they still have those opportunities down the road when I'm long gone, right? Because I know you, Randy, I know you know this, but it's something special to be able to do all the stuff that we love to do, whether hiking or fishing or hunting, but to also share those experiences with others is, I think, one of the greatest aspects of conservation.
Yeah. So Dustin asked the question again. You get to answer this. It's a two-part question. What about communities along the rivers that will have less control of flooding? And also, what can you tell us about a dry year when we don't have the bulk of water stocked up for droughts?
Yeah, for sure. So the 4 lower dams are actually considered what are deemed run-of-river dams. So they don't provide flood control. The reservoirs aren't as deep as, say, the reservoirs behind Bonneville or some of these larger dams on the Columbia River system or Columbia River Basin system. And so they basically have no effect on flood control at all. As for droughts, it's basically the exact same thing. These are smaller reservoirs that have little to significant fact for that aspect as well.
Cool. So Rob asks, what about the Chinook ? Those seem to be the major focus during the initial phases of dam removal, but I haven't heard much about them despite some light Googling.
Well, Chinook, I mean, if you look here in Washington and Oregon, we had a small spring Chinook season. I think we only had a handful of days that we were able to fish on the main stem of the Columbia. And that's just because the returns they were predicted to be very low, historic lows, really. And they're even coming in lower than what is predicted. Usually a goal is to have per species right around that 100,000 mark to sustain a population. We only had, I think, let me checking my notes. So if I'm looking down, I'm checking my notes so that I don't want to feed you guys wrong information. In 2018, only 7,000 Chinook made it past and survived their migration up the lower Snake River to Lewiston in Idaho. And so 7,000 fish compared to the needed 100,000 fish, it's unsurmountable odds that a wild fishery in itself right now would survive without implementation from hatcheries and other things.
So Bodie asks this question: how would the release of sediment from the 4 dams affect downstream habitat if the dams were to be breached?
Yeah. So what a lot of these dams do is they build up sediment over the years. A lot of this fine sediment is actually nutrient rich for habitat and smaller organisms that are found within the river systems. And so unfortunately, downriver, a lot of these organisms that thrive off of the sediment and the nutrient rich sediment don't have as much as historically they've had in the past. And so when we see dam removal, we see a big sediment push. And if you look at examples like the Elwha River, the main dam on the Elwha River up in Washington was removed. There was a big push of sediment, and actually that dumped all the way down out into the mouth, out into the Pacific Ocean, and created these massive algae blooms and basically this high nutrient-rich episode. Eventually, everything went back to normal, but there will be a big push of sediment throughout the river system. That's going to be critical for reviving habitat.
So Annie has another question.
Yep.
What other factors are affecting fish returns other than dams and predators? The Chinook salmon fishing season this year has been canceled on parts of the Salmon River.
Sure. So I guess I can answer this in a couple parts. There's always going to be natural factors to salmon mortality within their life history. Like I was saying, they're spending 3 to 6 months in fresh water when they're spawned, anywhere from 2 to 5 years into the ocean, and then they're returning back for a handful of months to spawning grounds. So throughout that entire time, they're facing natural changes, whether it's climate, predation, food scarcity. When you look at dams, if all 8 dams were removed, so the lower 4 on the Snake, as well as the main 4 on the Columbia, we would actually see a 50% cut in mortality for salmon and steelhead. So right now, it's estimated that 50% of mortality is coming from causes from these dams. And so when we're looking at other causes of predation, or actually other causes of mortality, we're talking about predation. So that's anything from mammals, so whales, birds, any other things that like to eat salmon. That's us as well. There's a 2% allotment, 1 to 2% quota that recreational anglers are allowed to take each year, or that's deemed to take. And so we put a little bit of a dent in there. But we also look at climate. Climate change has been putting a huge factor, is a huge factor on salmon returns right now as well. Warming oceans during the year when there shouldn't be as warm are affecting salmon populations. And so because of that, we're also seeing food scarcity in areas that used to be, food rich for these salmon and steelhead. So there's a ton of factors.
Bodie has another question about electricity. It says, could a new powerhouse be added to one of the dams downstream like Bonneville to make up for any lost power generation?
I mean, I guess it could. I don't know the logistics about adding on another powerhouse to Bonneville. But if we were to add, other renewables like solar and wind, the advances in solar and wind right now basically generate 2.5 times more electricity is more efficient than what those dams are doing right now. And so if we're investing money, and especially taxpayer dollars, into energy, I personally would want to go that route than adding more to these dams that are critically affecting wildlife on these rivers.
Did I hear you right earlier? You said $17 billion has already been spent trying to conserve these fish runs?
$17 billion.
Wow.
And that's all taxpayer dollars when we could be putting it into other means, right? We could be putting it into actual practices that would recover fish.
Well, back in the 70s, there was a congressional hearing, and one of the congressmen or senators said, $1 million here, $1 million there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. Well, now we're talking billions, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. we told people we'd keep them an hour, and we're
right at that mark. Yeah.
59 minutes. I don't know if you have. I'll let you wrap up whatever you want to leave the audience with, Chris.
Well, I'll thank anybody who's watching right now. Thank you guys for sticking around and listening to this conversation. It's one of those things that it's in our face. It's a great cause and something that's going to be really turning the tables if it gets more press. And it's already getting a lot of press right now between Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And so we're at a fun point where it's bubbling back up. It's been an issue for so many years. It's been an issue since these dams were even put in place. Back in 1960, when we were our first year as an organization, 4 years later, we were advocating against these dams to be put in. And so it's a time where they need to be upgraded or they need to be removed. And so if anybody feels passionate enough about this issue, or just wants to, spend 5 seconds when you receive a call to action to call your representative, please, please, please. Easiest thing you can do right now is go to that link in the description, sign up, spend 30 seconds to get however many, or to get more information and to get action alerts as this campaign unrolls. And so we're going to need you, we're going to need the voices, and we're going to need as many people as we can to speak on the behalf of salmon steelhead.
Well, if we've already spent 17 billion, it seems like it wouldn't be that hard to find some money to mitigate or, help those who might be financially affected by this. And, usually that awareness and consideration of those affected seems to make progress a little bit easier, and that's a pretty big pool of money to I'm thinking about that number, like, wow, that's a lot of money. But
a lot of money.
The downside, or the worry, I guess, and I don't, like I said, I'm not an expert on the issue, but usually when species or subspecies or fish stocks are gone, they don't come back. It's not something where you can remake them or retrain them or transplant them from here to there. It's, you can try, but it usually has its limited result, and it's still not the natural endemic species that was there, that evolved over whatever habitat it is. And it doesn't matter if we're talking fish species or terrestrial species or whatever. So, but, well, Chris, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Betsy, Jonathan, Matthew, thank you guys for actually pulling this off. And when I'm going to hit you up, we'll make a fair trade. I'll take you floating on the Yellowstone, and you take me steelhead fishing someday.
We can make that happen.
All right. Well, everyone who showed up tonight, thanks so much. We really appreciate it, and I hope you stay healthy. And I hope we see you somewhere outside, fishing, hunting, doing whatever it is on our great public land that we have in this country.
Thanks, everybody.